Welcome to the first section of Module 5 on monitoring and evaluation. Sections 2 and 3, as you will see later, go into more practical detail about the processes, the actors, the key performance indicators that we use when we monitor and evaluate an education sector policy or an education sector plan. This section is somewhat more theoretical in approach. It looks at different concepts and it also examines how these concepts translate into reality. So, for the content of this presentation, we will discuss the meaning of various terms. We'll start with results-based management, a very popular term at the moment. We'll then look at what do monitoring and evaluation carry as meanings. They are terms that are used very regularly together, but they are referring to different activities. Finally, we will also ask the question, what does the term accountability mean? In between, at a certain moment, I will ask you also to reflect on the reasons why we do monitoring and evaluation. So let us start by looking at the term results-based management. It is good to recall that there are different modes, different models of management. One way of managing is by looking at the available budget, looking at the inputs and the resources that we can purchase with that budget and manage on the basis of the budget. The budget, to a large extent, will define what we are going to do and how we will manage the organization. The second approach is by focusing on the activities that we will do. We know more or less what is our mandate, what is our mission, and we will define a number of projects, a number of activities. To a large extent, we will look at how we will use the budget, how we will implement the resources that we have. Second approach. The third approach is what we call results-based management. Here the focus is on the results that we want to achieve. It is not incorrect to say that over time we have moved from a more budget-based approach to a project approach, and now results-based management is the popular approach. But at the same time, in many organizations, there is still, of course, a lot of attention to the budget, and many organizations still need to manage projects, to manage the implementation of their activities. What does results-based management actually mean? Can we propose a definition? And I propose the following definition. Results-based management is evidently a management approach. It aims at bringing together a whole organization, all the staff of the organization, around a set of clearly defined results. And it does, the managers who use results-based management, they do that by continuously monitoring the achievement of these results. So there will be regular collection of data on are we achieving the results that we have identified. We will define remedial action when such remedial action is needed, and we will also reward and sanction staff in function of these achievements. That is a definition of result-based management. This definition reflects a number of key principles of results-based management. The first one is evident. Results-based management focuses on results, and results in terms of the outcomes that we want to achieve and the impact that we want to contribute to. We'll come back to that a little later. The idea also behind results-based management is that we will hold the organization, the different staff in the organization, the different departments, the different units, the different schools maybe, even the different teachers, we will hold them accountable for these results, for their contribution to the overall results of the organization. Such accountability can only work if there is transparency around results. That is the argument, at least. In order to hold people accountable, we need to check on the results that they have achieved. We need to get good information, but that information will also be publicly available in many cases. It certainly will be available within the organization so that we can strengthen accountability. Finally, the focus is also or at least the intention is also to get the organization to change, to have a flexible organization which will adapt to the state of progress, and through regular checking, regular evaluation of how far we have reached in the results that we want to achieve, we'll propose maybe a new approach, and therefore results-based management is characterized by adaptability. It is good to recall, as you may remember also from the fourth module, that when we talk about results, we can refer to different types of results. We can refer to the outputs, which are the immediate results of our activity. We train teachers, our activity is teacher training. The output is 100 teachers that have been trained. We can distinguish between output and outcome. When these 100 teachers have been trained, the outcome would be better teaching in the classroom. The impact, we hope, is that this will contribute to higher quality of education and maybe even to a more economically developing country and a socially more well-working society. The impact is always the very far away element, the faraway vision that we want to contribute to. And so results-based management, in order to function properly, will need to be accompanied by some form of theory of change, some intervention logic, which demonstrates precisely the link between the inputs, the activities, and these different types of results. Because indeed, the argument is that if certain results have not been achieved, we need to understand why not. And in order to do so, in order to understand why not, we need that logic, that intervention logic, that theory of change, that logical framework, as it may be called. This slide shows you an example of such a logic chain, or such a theory of change. We have the inputs, in this case trainers, funds, supplies, equipment. We have the activities, building of schools, teacher training, and service, maybe even pre-service. We have textbook production. These activities, they lead to some immediate outputs, the numbers of schools built, the numbers of teachers trained, the numbers of textbooks distributed. And this is expected to contribute to an outcome in terms, for instance, of enrollment and learning results, which in itself is then contributing to the overall impact, the enhanced education of the population. And so the outputs, the outcomes, the impact are the results. And we can decide to focus on these lower level results, outputs, or these higher level results, outcomes and impact. This is a very brief overview of what results-based management stands for. As you will have understood already, in order for results-based management to function properly, we need to regularly monitor and regularly evaluate in how far our results are being achieved. And we also need to ensure that this is translated into accountability. So in the next few slides, we will look a little bit more at monitoring and evaluation, and then later on again at accountability. Let me start with a question to you, a little exercise maybe. Namely, I would like you to write down one or two terms or words or concepts, but short descriptions that you immediately think about when you hear the term monitor. What else comes in your mind when you hear the term monitoring? One or two words, not more. And do the same for evaluation. Again, one or two words, not more. What are the words that immediately come up in your mind? The purpose of this exercise is, first of all, for you already to see if you can assess the difference between monitoring and evaluation, but also to see if the words that you came up with, if they are indeed the ones that I will also highlight. Take a few seconds to do so. Okay, let me propose now for both monitoring and evaluation a definition, and I'll make some additional comments. Let me start with monitoring. What you see here is a definition of monitoring. It is adapted from an OECD publication by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Monitoring is a continuing function. Monitoring is not something that you do every 5-6 months. It is, to a large extent, a daily exercise. It's an integral part of our daily work. It's a function that uses the systematic collection of data on specified indicators to provide management and the main stakeholders with indications on the use of allocated resources, the progress in implementation, the progress with the achievement of results. So monitoring is very much data-based. We will have identified a number of indicators. We want to see these indicators will refer to results, will refer maybe also to implementation, will refer to the resources that we want to use. So we systematically collect data, and on the basis of the collection of the data, the analysis of these data, we will have information that we will send to the management, the main stakeholders, on the use of allocated resources, the progress in implementation, and the progress with the achievement of results. 2 points that I want to highlight here. Firstly, monitoring usually is undertaken by the people who are actually responsible for the implementation of activities. Monitoring is not done from the outside. It might be a ministry department, it might be a government agency, it might be a district office, it might be a school. We, as actors in the system, who are responsible for implementation, we will monitor how we are progressing, how well we are doing. And the questions that usually will be asked are questions about, okay, how are the inputs, the resources, the budget, how are these resources being used? Secondly, the activities that we have planned, are we actually carrying them out as foreseen? Are they being completed as foreseen? The results that we intend to achieve, are they indeed being achieved? Are we on track? Are we producing the outputs that we expected? And finally, are remedial actions needed? These are questions related to monitoring. In a moment, we will look at evaluation and keep in mind these questions as well as the people who are responsible so that we can see the distinction. Evaluation now is the systematic assessment of an ongoing or a completed policy or plan, including its design, its implementation and results, to assess the relevance of strategy and the fulfillment of objectives with the purpose of informing decision-making. When you see here evaluation, you can see certain things that are similar to monitoring. It is systematic, the purpose is to inform decision-making, it looks at a policy, a plan, it looks at its implementation and its results, but it also goes further. It tends to happen, first of all, when a big part of the policy or the plan is already being or has already been implemented, rather. It looks also at the design of this policy or plan, and it actually asks questions that go deeper about the relevance of strategy and the fulfillment of objectives. As we have done for monitoring, for evaluation, we will take a look now at who are the actors that evaluate and what are some of the key questions. And maybe you can already think about that. Who do you think usually evaluates a policy or plan? We said that those who implement are the ones who monitor. Is that the same for those who evaluate? In many cases, no. In many cases, evaluation will be done by external actors. We will bring in somebody from the outside who will do the evaluation. It can be a midterm evaluation, it can be a final evaluation, it can be an evaluation for a particular purpose. But in many cases, we'll get an outside actor from time to time, and I think that's actually very beneficial. It may be a mixed team where an internal group will sit down together with external actors, and together they will evaluate the relevance of the strategy, the performance of the organization, and so on. Evaluations may also be undertaken by internal actors, that's a sort of self-evaluation, but there will regularly be a feeling that if an evaluation is assigned completely to internal actors, there is maybe less distance than is needed. There is maybe a risk of complacency. If evaluation is assigned to external actors also, of course, one of the challenges is the lack of knowledge, because sometimes things, sometimes structures, habits, norms exist in an organization that only the internal actors really know. So in many cases, it can be considered an ideal scenario whereby internal and external actors evaluate together. And what are the questions that are asked by evaluators? These questions go beyond the questions for monitoring. The first one is to some extent similar to the questions that we've heard when we were discussing monitoring. Are results being achieved? Here, has the policy, the plan achieved its objective? But then the questions become deeper. When you monitor, to a large extent, you accept the policy or the plan as it is. You accept that this is the policy or plan that you work with, and you see in how far are we implementing it. When you evaluate, you actually start putting into question the policy and the plan itself. You will ask questions about the strategies. Have they been successful? Why not? Have they been less successful? Why? And so on. Is there a need to rethink the plan's objectives? What lessons can we learn for the future? So we have a much more profound interrogation and a more critical assessment of the policy, the plan, the project, whatever we may be evaluating. This slide now puts together and compares monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring, as we said, tends to be continuous exercise. Evaluation tends to take place at specific points in time. Monitoring is usually carried out by the implementing actors, and therefore is an internal exercise, while the evaluation will usually be under the responsibility of a very high level and may be assigned, may be outsourced to external actors. The monitoring exercise is tracking progress towards predetermined targets. We do not put into question these targets, we accept them as they are. The evaluation exercise is broader. It looks at the conditions of success and failure, the lessons learned, and it may put into question indeed if the policy and the plan that we are evaluating, was that really the best policy, the best plan. The instruments, let's say, the data sources that we use are also different. The monitoring exercise will focus on operational plans usually, and is based on activity reports, on the progress with key performance indicators. Evaluation looks at the long-term plans and policies, and does not only use indicators, but also reports, qualitative studies, interviews, focus group discussions, and so on. It is, of course, not an either or. It is not that we need either to monitor or to evaluate. We tend to have to do both things. We need to monitor and evaluate. It's a bit unfortunate, actually, that this concept of monitoring and evaluation has become so joint that in many cases we refer to M&E as one exercise, which to some extent it should be, but it should still be an exercise that is both relying on a monitoring approach and an evaluation approach, because they are quite different. And indeed, what we have seen in many countries is that we may be monitoring the plan, we may be monitoring the policy, we will collect data on the results we have achieved, on the activities we have undertaken. We will see in how far we are coming closer to our identified objective, but we don't sufficiently evaluate. We don't sufficiently ask the question, are these really the strategies that we should have implemented? Has this plan really identified the best objectives? Should the nature, the content of the plan change? We need both sets of exercises. We need them working together, and therefore in many cases they may belong to the same unit. They may be under the responsibility of a similar unit, but we should not confound them. They are still separate exercises. Let me now go to the second discussion in this introductory section, in the section 1, namely, why do we monitor and evaluate education policies and plans? And I ask you again to reflect on this before we continue with this presentation. How do you see that? What do you think are the reasons? Can you identify 2, 3 reasons maybe why it is useful to do monitoring and evaluation? When you have been able to write down your thoughts or your own answers, I will present now 4 reasons why it is useful or maybe even indispensable to do monitoring and evaluation, and it would be interesting again to see if you had the same points coming up. Firstly, and that's maybe most evidently, we monitor and we evaluate in order to guide the implementation of the policy, the implementation of the path, the plan. We want to see if we are indeed on the right path. We want to see if we are progressing towards the objectives that we wanted to achieve. The second reason, and I referred to that already to some extent, is that we also, through monitoring and evaluation, and certainly when we are in a results-based management approach, we want to create accountability and commitment. We want to create a sense of responsibility by identifying who is responsible for what, but we will also hold the actors accountable, and we will act. When some actors are underperforming, we may give them more support. Sometimes we may also sanction them. So a second reason is to create that accountability. A third reason, and it is something that we may not always think about, is that finally, the purpose of monitoring and evaluation, one purpose is also to gain better knowledge. Of course, we want to learn, and we want to learn not as an individual, but we want to learn as a whole institute, or an institution, an organization, as a whole educational administration. We want to gain better knowledge about what works and what does not work, and why and how can we change it. But finally, and most importantly, we do monitoring and evaluation to actually change practice, to improve policy and practice, through better informed decisions about both implementation and about policies and plans. And this is the most important issue. I have mentioned this already, I think, once before, that one risk with the emphasis on monitoring and evaluation is that we collect so many data that we actually spend more time on data collection than on using these data in order to improve what we are doing, in order to change practice. And a good monitoring and evaluation cycle will always translate what we learn into action, but in many cases, that cycle of improvement is not complete. We do collect data, we analyze them, and that we tend to do quite regularly, but learning from that analysis already takes place less and less, and actually changing action, redefining a program, rethinking a policy, because of what we've monitored and evaluated, because of what we've learned through monitoring and evaluation, that tends not to happen as regularly as it should. So we've been looking at the concept of results-based management, we've been looking at the concept of monitoring, we've been looking at the concept of evaluation. Now we are going to look at a concept that we have referred to already and that deserves some more detailed examination, namely the concept of accountability. When discussing accountability, we need to keep in mind that accountability has actually two meanings, or at least there are two implications of any system of accountability. Accountability implies that we will hold people accountable for their actions, but it also implies that these same people feel responsibility for these actions. Accountability has a double meaning, and both elements are essential in the adoption of results-based management, where we tend to hold people accountable for their actions, but we also expect that they feel that responsibility. But this term, accountability, and this statement, we hold people accountable for their actions, actually does not answer an essential question, namely, to whom do we hold people accountable? Who can ask for accountability? Who has that power? Who has that authority? Who has a legitimacy to ask, in this case, education staff, such as teachers, principals, administrators, to ask accountability from them? And that question actually can get different answers, and each of these answers will lead to different systems of monitoring, different systems of evaluation, and to quite different results-based management processes. In this slide, I have summarized the 4 different responses to the question, to whom are education staff accountable? And I've used the example of teachers. A first argument can be as a teacher, but the same is of course true for a principal, the same is true for an education officer or a curriculum officer, but the example works well with teachers. So teachers have signed a contract, usually with the Ministry of Education or with their school, with a private network maybe. In any case, they have signed a contract, and the accountability they have is towards the unit with which they have entered into contractual relationship. That's what we call contractual accountability. As a teacher, I am therefore accountable to the ministry or to the school, to the district office. A second argument that regularly is used is no. A teacher actually belongs to a specific professional community. A teacher is a member of the professional community, and the only ones who really have the legitimacy, the credibility to properly hold teachers accountable are other teachers, because they are the only ones who have the same knowledge, the same expertise, the same experience. That's what we call professional accountability. This is the type of accountability that you have, for instance, in the medical world, where usually, so not always, usually doctors are held accountable by an order of doctors, an order of the medical order, because the argument goes that the only ones who really have the professional experience, expertise, knowledge to hold doctors accountable are other doctors. This is something also that you will see very much in higher education systems and university systems, where for many, many decades, even centuries, the argument went that the only ones who really can hold professors accountable are other professors who are of a similar status with the same professionalism. And it is, of course, a type of accountability that from time to time teacher unions, teacher associations will defend strongly. The third argument is to say no, actually, as a teacher, as a principal, as an education officer, we are public servants. That means we are supposed to service the public, to serve the public. And therefore, it is that public that can hold us accountable. It is that public that can ask us to demonstrate that we are performing properly, that we are taking care of the children, that we are taking care of the education we prefer. This is especially the case when that same public is actually contributing and paying for our salaries through taxation. So that is what we call public accountability, but even this particular type of accountability, again, can be understood in two different ways. One way of understanding it is by saying that as a teacher, I am accountable to the public as a whole, any potential parent. That is what we tend to call then public or market accountability. And the reasoning will go that, therefore, every parent has the right to know how my school functions. A second interpretation of this public accountability is that, no, as a teacher, I am, of course, accountable, yes, to the public, but that is the public that is in my school. It is the school community. I'm responsible towards the parents of the children that I teach. And then we have what we could call a sort of community accountability. The public is the public that is within and around my school. So, as you can see, this term accountability can be understood in different ways, and that leads actually to really quite different realities in terms of the type of monitoring, the type of evaluation we can have. So, the development of a monitoring and evaluation system requires that we respond to at least two broad questions. The first question is the question that we started with at the beginning of this presentation, namely, our management, our monitoring, our evaluation can focus on inputs, the resources, the budget. It can focus on the activities, the projects, the process, we could call that also, or it can focus on the results, which could be the outputs, the outcomes, the impact. And that in itself is already a choice we have to make. The term results-based management tends to imply that these days most of our monitoring and evaluation is on the results, but in many cases, ministries of education still need to show clearly that they have used resources properly, that they have implemented activities and projects as expected, and therefore the monitoring and evaluation will maybe be less uniquely results-based than we may expect. Second question is the question that we've just been discussing: who will hold actors accountable? And in function of the replies that we formulate to these questions, we will also have different systems. And I will show in two slides how this can change, what are the implications for monitoring, and I will do that by looking at monitoring a particular theme, a particular area of great concern, great interest these days, namely the area of quality. This graph, or this table rather, shows you three types of monitoring in function of the focus of our monitoring, and to a large extent this will be the same for evaluation. The focus can be on the inputs into the quality process, the teaching learning process itself, or the academic achievement, which are then more the results. When the focus is on the inputs, we tend to call this compliance monitoring. And the reference behind it, the theory behind it, is that of the bureaucratic organization, which argues that if we provide our actors in the education system with sufficient inputs, and if they respect all of the norms and all of the standards related to these inputs, then our system will function properly. The goal is to have a standardized formal quality system, and in many cases, the inspectorate in its traditional meaning of the word, the inspectorate was the main monitoring tool. The focus of the inspectorate was mainly on checking if indeed rules and regulations were respected, if inputs were available and were properly used. If the focus shifts to the teaching learning process, then the reference here is more a reference of pedagogy. The idea being that, okay, in order to improve quality, we need to monitor the process. We need to provide sufficient support to teachers and to learners, that there is efficient learning, and this will take place mainly through advisory services. And that's what tends to be called diagnostic monitoring. And then the attention again can shift now more to what could be called achievement in terms of examinations, in terms of assessment tests. And here the argument is again an argument that is that if we provide the public of the education system with information about the academic achievement of schools and students, some form of competition will be created that will lead to better academic achievement in general. And the main tool for monitoring will be the league tables that may be published on the basis of standardized tests. That's what we call performance monitoring. These are ideal types, as we say in the literature, in the sense that these are simplifications of reality. In most countries, you will have a bit of compliance monitoring, you will have a bit of diagnostic monitoring, and these days you have quite a lot of performance monitoring, but it will rarely be only one of these models. But the accent that is put, the emphasis that is put will differ. And it's important that we keep that in mind, that these are not exactly the same ways of monitoring, that there can be significant differences there. And that each of those are built on some argument. If we want to monitor quality properly, we need to monitor if inputs are available and are properly used. But we also indeed need to monitor how teachers perform in the classroom, and if necessary, offer them support. And of course, we need to look at the results. We need to look at the results in order to see which schools may need more support, but we can also use these results as information for parents so that they will select the schools in function of results, and that those who perform well will get more support from parents, those who perform poorly will get less support. Personally, I don't believe much in this market competition theory in education, because educators do not automatically change because of competition between schools, but it is an argument that is certainly very well used or very regularly used. This graph, this table looked at the focus. The next table will look more at the what we call the locus of responsibility. This table makes a distinction now between 4 quality monitoring systems in function of the actor that has the authority to a large extent to hold schools, teachers accountable. You will remember the discussion we had a few slides back. And here we make a distinction between 4 models. Each time again, keep in mind these are simplifications of reality. The first model assigns the responsibility for controlling, monitoring, evaluating the education system to the state bureaucracy, the state's administration, the Ministry of Education, district offices, and so on, who are representing the population as a whole. And the key monitoring device, again, is the inspectorate here. That is what we could call the public or the state control model. The second model is what can be called a professional accountability model, where here the argument is that the teachers are the ones who can actually exercise control over other teachers. They have the professional expertise, they have the ethics, and that will translate them into more self-evaluation and peer reviewing, peer support. In the third case, we are more in a partnership model, the argument being here that in order for schools to be properly monitored, we have to allow the school community, the parents, the students, to exercise some form of control over the school, because they are the ones who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of that school. And in any case, that grassroots participation will actually lead to an improvement of the school because there will be a better relationship between the school and its surrounding community. And in this case, we would have as a monitoring device a sort of self-review of the school in which the whole school community will participate. And finally, we have what we could call the free market model, where the argument is that if we provide all of the parents, the individual consumers, with information on the performance of schools, automatically, because of the market system, those schools who do well will become more attractive, they will get more students. Those schools who do poorly, they will lose students, but in order to gain students, they will improve their performance. And we need performance information as a key monitoring device. With that, we come to the end of this presentation. It is quite possible that at the end this has become more complicated and complex than you thought, but that was to some extent the purpose. The whole discussion about monitoring and evaluation is indeed a complex discussion. The required readings we gave you showed that also because you got 2 required readings which arrived at quite contrasting conclusions about the value of monitoring and in particular the value of quantitative performance monitoring, quantitative evaluation of performance, with one publication arguing that this is indeed the way forward for public management, another publication arguing that this has gone too far now, and this tyranny of metrics, as the book is called, has actually led to harmful events. One of the main points that I want you to keep in mind is indeed that this is a discussion that is partly technical, but also very much a political discussion, because once we talk about monitoring, once we talk about evaluation, we are talking to some extent about who has the power to define what we want to achieve, and who has the power to control those who will be working towards achieving our vision, our dream. And those questions are always also to some extent political questions. In the next 2 sections of this module, we will become a bit more practical. We will go into questions that are more closely related to our work as education officers, as planners, as statisticians, as curriculum officers, and so on. But I think it is useful to keep this complexity of monitoring and evaluation in mind. Thank you.